There the blue waited like a question. On the morning the rumor gathered itself into momentum, Eunuch Rong came as if a gust of air sent through the studio door. He had the practiced step of a man whose duty was to go unseen, yet his face told of news that could not hide. He proffered a scrap of paper folded several times, and held with the care one would afford a small jewel. Without ceremony he laid it on Mei Lin's worktable. The paper bore the Grand Secretary's stamp and a single line of instruction: dyes and pigments to be strictly rationed. Public festivals to be muted. Private workshops subject to inspection. Mei Lin read and felt the inside of her chest hollow in a new way. The edict was not a mere bureaucratic preference. It was a tightening band. It translated fear into policy. It named the intangible dread that had been threading through the palace: fewer colors, fewer possibilities, a world made safe by becoming small, by being diminished. He paused in the doorway long enough to look at her hands, stained in years of grinding. He did not speak of sympathy. Eunuch Rong's sympathy always looked like a careful calibration of risk. Instead he said, quietly, "The Grand Secretary believes restraint will stop the rest from falling apart. He thinks color makes people remember what they lost and thus creates unrest. And yet we remember nothing else," Mei Lin answered, the words low as a brushstroke. "Color is memory." He made a sound that might have been a laugh or a cough. "Be careful. The court is listening." He left the edict folded under his sleeve like a sleeping mouse. That afternoon, a narrow curtain in an inner corridor parted and Consort Lion slipped into the studio as if she, too, feared that being seen would dissipate her. She moved with the grace of someone who had learned to make small boldnesses count, tucking a hand into a sleeve, as if it carried both treasure and danger. The consort looked older in this light. The palace had leached not only colors, but the quickness from faces. Yet when she spoke of the emperor her voice rewound, and the room itself seemed to remember how to hold warmth. He laughed, once for a long time, when the spring banners were new. Consort Lion said, pulling a lacquer box from her sleeve. She opened it without looking, the way one opens a box that has been opened often in private. Inside were strips of embroidery, coils of thread, a tiny cuff with a faded rose stitched into its seam. He liked the red of a pomegranate seed. He liked the blue of the sea at dawn. He would lap his hand at color like a child with honey. Mei Lin watched the way the consort's fingers toyed with the embroidery as if the cloth itself might speak. There was an intimacy in those scraps that no official record could house. A court historian might catalogue decrees, but here the tiny stitches stored nights and voices. Lion's offer was not patronage in form, no silk to commission a work, no appointment, but an equally potent grace, access to memory, to what had been worn against skin and against longing. From the box Consort Lion drew an object wrapped in brittle paper. She unfurled it with the hesitant reverence of someone unwrapping a relic. There, coiled like a pulse within a cuff, lay a single thread of band dye, dark and compressed. It had been hidden in a seam for decades, kept because a seam can be a good place to bury trouble. The thread was not brilliant. Time had made it deep rather than loud, the way a remembered name turns into a flavor in the mouth. But when Mei Lin touched it, she felt a little oscillation inside, as if color were a living thing that answered the brush of a palm. "Why give this to me?" Mei Lin asked. She had seen many gifts. This was more than a gift. It was a covenant. "Because you do not sing for favor," Consort Lion said. "You do not make yourself a louder thing to be noticed. You carry things in private, and that is dangerous but honest." He asked once, long ago, for something with this shade. "I have kept it because his fingers may fall upon it again." They both listened then for a moment to the palace, which had become a place of cautious breathing. The consort's hair had a smudge of mortar in it from her needlework, as if she had been in a workshop rather than an audience chamber. When she spoke of the emperor, the threads of the past knotted and unraveled like tapestry. "Will you use it?" she asked. Mei Lin considered the thread like a small star. To use forbidden dye was a kind of sacrament and a kind of theft. It was the opening of a sealed thing. It would be a balm for memory and a provocation to those who wanted order. "I will be careful," she said. She took the thread and hid it in the fold of her sleeve. The paper rustled outside. In the galleries, a child cried somewhere, and it sounded too loud. Not all news moved with such soft hands. Apprenticed son was a different wind. He was young, a boy whose eagerness created small storms. He had the fleet fingers and the open stare of someone who loved light and was sometimes reckless in his search for it. He had seen something earlier that day, a painted fan left for repair, and the thrill of witnessing color had been like a bell inside him. He found 2 other servants in a corridor lined with dull jars and tiles and could not help himself. His voice tripped, quick as a stone down steps. "You would not believe," he said. Glowing there was blue like the sea, and the brush strokes were like feathers. It felt like the Emperor's laughter. I saw it, and I swear the other servants had been quiet with fear, but Sun's light was magnetic. They pressed closer until a passing attendant, a woman who regularly took reports to the Grand Secretary's office, heard and afterward carried that sound into a place where fear collected and grew teeth. It was not malice so much as a hunger for news that turned the palace into a rumor mill. Word crossed from servant to clerk to official like water down a sleepy stream, picking up sediment. The Grand Secretary's circle loved certainty, and rumors about prohibited things tasted like evidence. The next morning, the outer galleries hummed with a rumor that the Grand Secretary would speak on the economy of displays. His decrees arrived in the form of a carefully worded proclamation, public exhibitions of pigments to be curtailed, private workshops to maintain inventories accessible to inspectors, and merchants trading in exotic ores to register their origins. The paper was stamped, its seal loud and final in black. Those who made a living at the edges of color dye merchants, banner weavers, lacquerers felt the stitch tighten. Madame Zoe, the banner weaver whose hands had made flags that once unfurled like songbooks, came to Mei Lin's doorway with eyes like small weathered coins. She had been in the city longer than many officials had been alive, and could read a policy for what it meant to the margins: less demand, more competition for the banned things, more danger if one was caught with contraband pigments. She spoke in terms of livelihood and of taste. "When the court stops buying, merchants stop venturing to the coast," she said. "When merchants stop venturing, men do foolish things farther inland. This is how scarcity makes worse things. You know how it goes." Mei Lin nodded. She knew. She thought of the southern towns sapped of their ores and of miners who had once hummed as they hauled clay in the rain. She thought of Zhao's stories of small villages emptied of their work and their songs. The edict was not only an attack on her practice. It was an extraction of people from life. Even as threads of fear tightened, a different kind of thread pride wove quietly among those who kept old knowledge. Scholar Lawai, who sometimes argued with the Grand Secretary in the privacy of his study, wrote notes in margins where no one would look, citing precedent for ritual colors as part of state ceremony. He did not yet speak aloud on Mei Lin's behalf, but he had the mind to frame a case. If color had been a tool of state ritual in the past, perhaps it could be argued back into legitimacy. His mind was a map of small openings. That evening, Mei Lin worked at a little restoration on the edge of secrecy. She took the thread Consort Lion had given and unraveled it before a tiny dish of rice paste. The dye lay on her palm like a small, contained night. Grinding it out required patience. The mineral had to be coaxed between stone and pestle, the mordant balanced to keep the pigment from strangling itself or running wild. When she lifted a hair-thin brush and laid the first stroke on a porcelain rim, the color did not leap, but bled in like a dawn shading the horizon. It was subtle, a softened blue that folded into the bone of the bowl. The bowl hummed with possibility. Apprenticed son watched from the doorway. He had to be told several times to keep silent. His excitement made him clumsy. He hovered like a moth, It's more than a pigment, Mei Lin said without looking up. It remembers the hand that used it. It is patient in ways powder is not. It feels like a secret hero, Sun said. He did not mean more than fervor. He meant loyalty. His voice was almost a whisper, but it carried, because eagerness has a warp that makes sound hold. Mei Lin almost laughed at the boy's earnestness, at the absurd heroism he found in a handful of ground ore, but she stopped herself. The edges of the world had sharp teeth. They had already taken more. When night came down on the palace, it did not change color, of course, but the small blue on the bowl made the room warmer to look at. Consort Lion's thread had been a votive. In it were the promises of a memory, the H of a court that had learned to make do with less. Outside, down corridors and through quadrangles, the Grand Secretary's edict circulated. Watchfulness thickened into a presence like a low wind. Mei Lin packed the bowl into a cloth and made notes in her journal, a line about the mordant, the exact angle the brush took to lift the pigment's heart. She wrote about the look on Ankh Sun's face and sealed the memory like a color swatch. The work would have to continue in whispers, in the back of Jiao's kiln beyond the salt roads, in the cracked houses of harbor towns where Marina and kept his hidden coves. The palace was where the heart beat. The work that would heal that heart had to hide its pulse. By morning the rumor had multiplied. A servant in the market had hummed a tune with a line the emperor once loved. Someone else had overheard and gone to a vendor to ask for a red the vendor did not have any more. So even as edicts asked for restraint, the people found small rebellions in their mouths. The court, however, was a different thing. It could not afford the small pleasures of private remembering. Its logic was institutional, and institutions feared contagion. Mei Lin slept badly that night. She dreamed of swallows that forgot how to fly, of banners folded into themselves, of a boy whose voice became a bell tolling the end of small things. Yet within the dream a particular blue glowed like a lamp. She woke, took up her brush, and began to work again. The palace had become a room full of contradictions. Those who wanted a colorless order for the sake of survival, and those who believed in color as a way to hold on to what was human and particular. Mei Lin moved between these halves like a seamstress will between two patterns, always mindful of the tension. In the weeks to come the market of whispers would expand. Merchants would murmur, courtiers would weigh their next statement, apprentices would misstep and betray routes. The edicts would make the Grand Secretary proud, and those edicts would make for enemies who could be less easily counted than ministers or soldiers. The danger multiplied. The thread from Consort Lion had given Mei Lin air to breathe. It had also tied her tighter to the fate of others. The real test would be how much color could be coaxed from the world before the world closed in its hands to smother it. For now, in the hush of her studio, Mei Lin put the blue away. She held the bowl under her hand like a small, patient animal. She did not yet know whether the Grand Secretary's view would harden into prosecution, or whether the ephemeral joys she could release would outlast the fear. She only knew the simple truth that had always guided her, that a brush could be as necessary as a word, that a remembered shade could call a face back again. The palace might whisper its disapproval, but whispers could gather into a sound if enough people chose to listen. Outside, as the sun skewed low and the stone of the courtyards cool, a guard passed a notice nailed to a pillar, a listing for inspectors to report to the Grand Secretary's office. A new notice, one line darker than the last. It was administrative in tone, but men who read it felt a chill. In the inner court, voices dimmed. In the outer court, songs tried to reassert themselves. Mei Lin dipped her brush in water and then in a dish of prepared pigment. The stroke she made was private, and then public, invisible to most but momentous to the one whose hand guided it. The feathered line opened into a blue that did not roar. It healed. The bowl would go back to the tray, and perhaps someone would see it and remember a face. Perhaps the emperor would be made more whole for a single breath. Perhaps the act would be noticed. Perhaps it would not. The choice had already been made by a woman with quiet hands and a small braided thread. The palace could whisper. The small rebellions of belonging would not be loud. But they would continue, and in the continuing there was hope, fragile as a bloom but real. At the edge of the day a messenger returned to Eunuch Rong and bowed low. The Grand Secretary's office had received word from a provincial official about a public banner's sudden bloom of color. The messenger's eyes were careful. The edict's band tightened. Mei Lin folded her sleeves back and washed the blue from her fingers. The color stained her skin like a faint remnant of the sea. She thought of the swallows. The sorting of fear and courage in the palace was only beginning. There would be more whispers, and some would become cries. The inner court had remembered what it had once believed it could hide, that memory is stubborn and that some shades cannot be truly erased. The danger was real and immediate, but so was the small green of hope that had threaded itself through Consort Lion's box of scraps. Mei Lin set the journal on the table, and, with the methodical hand of a woman who had learned to live by a ledger of hues, added the day's notes. "Keep your voice small," she told Sun when he lingered to sweep up. He nodded like a young thing chastened but not chastisable. Outside the studio an attendant repealed news of inspectors, and the palace took a breath like a held thing. At the edge of night, Mei Lin locked her door, hid the blue in the lining of her skirt, and walked to the lattice to look at the court. The flame of a single lantern swayed. Within its small glow she saw how fragile everything would be if it were to be fought for. She thought of the Grand Secretary, of his black robes and the way his mind flattened things into order. She thought of the Emperor and his moments of return. The choice between quietness and making a noise that could break the system had been placed upon every hand that dared to hold a brush. She would have to learn where to sing and where to be silence. A whisper is little until it becomes a song. Mei Lin did not yet have a chorus, but she had a note, a small true blue, pressed like a coin in her palm. She folded that coin into her memory and waited. The palace slept, but the whisper would ripple, and someone, sooner rather than later, would listen. The following morning, in the courtyard where inspectors sometimes gathered, and where the banners hung listless, a small knot of people paused as a child pointed to a bowl in the making house and chattered about a blue that resembled the tides the child's grandfather had described. A woman laughed in a private way and covered her mouth. Behind them, masked by the ordinary commerce of the day, the Grand Secretary's men watched with the attentive eyes of men who collect evidence. The stage was set. The court's fault lines would show their angles. Mei Lin had placed a stone in the water, and the ripples were spreading with an economy no one could command. The palace, dimmed as it was, would soon learn the price of each bright act. And so the whisper kept moving, from hand to hand, from seam to seam, until the sound of memory could not be entirely contained. Mei Lin folded her hands and waited for what would come next, knowing that every brushstroke was now also a choice placed against the architecture of power. The low room smelled of salt and smoke, and crushed stone, an odorous ledger of trades performed and losses kept. Mei Lin's sleeve brushed the kiln-warmed table as she leaned forward, an unlit lamp throwing a pale oval over Jiao's weathered hands. He had set before them a strip of porcelain, a garden bowl with a hairline that begged repair, and slices of raw mineral, some ground, some left as shards, each labeled in a cramped hand that trembled toward the origin sea. Beyond the single latticed window night hung heavy over the salt road. The distant sea breathed like an animal at rest, and somewhere a gull called once, twice, like punctuation. Jiao turned the small stone in his palm as if he could read the world in its grain. "You watch the color as one watches a child," he said. His voice was low as a kiln ember. "You must learn patience, but you already have an eye. That is not something I can teach as easily as a method." Mei Lin held the porcelain close and nodded. She had started the evening's work seated, at the bench, Shed begged Jiao, for he had finally agreed to take her brushes and her confidence in return for the care of 2 jars and a promise to never name his sources. The deal had always been unequal. He gave her the frame of his workshop in exchange for the promise that her hands would not do what his had done long ago, barter away the craft for safety. She ground a pinch of the cobalt-hued mineral against the stone, rotating her wrist in the old rhythm taught by her grandmother, stone to powder. Powder to paste with a measured dance of water. The paste at first had the dull bruise of raw war. When she added a single grain of ferment and odd, bitter tincture Jiao had coaxed from fermented rice husks, the paste brightened as if listening to a remembered name. There, Jiao murmured. He pointed with a bent finger to the rim. Mei Lin dipped a fine squirrel hair brush, feeling the bristles spring like a heartbeat, and laid the first line. The blue slid on like a cool tongue, the way the color of a distant shore slides into the mind and anchors it there. They watched as the pigment dried, then brushed a breath of water and a touch of oil to set it. The glaze caught the lamp, and the lapis blue turned luminous, not the raw intensity of the sea, but an echo, a calibrated memory. Mei Lin imagined a child's eyelid opening onto ocean for the first time and felt a sudden, sharp tenderness. "It holds," Jiao said, and for a moment his face slackened from its habitual sternness. He pressed a ringed hand to his chest, a small, private victory. "It remembers." That small act blue on the lip of a bowl would not change history. It did not intend to. It was an offering, a petition sent to the bone house of memory. The bowl belonged to a washerwoman who swept the palace courts when dawn was still a rumor. She had been brought a repaired piece under the pretense of barter. Later, the maid would cup the bowl and recall a lullaby, a name, a face her mind had abandoned for months. Those returned pieces, vivid as they were fragile, began to thread through the palace, leaving traces on tongues and in the hollowed minds of men who were supposed to remember their titles and their names. Mei Lin had learned to keep such transformations modest, the way one trims a flame so it warms but does not consume. Each restoration required more than pigment and hand. It required awareness of who might watch, what rumors might form, and whether those rumors would be grateful tears or the shape of accusation. Word did not travel fast in the beginning, but it traveled with an economy reserved for necessary things. A repaired teacup returned a phrase to a chambermaid. A painted bird on a scroll made an attendant whisper an old line of verse. Small recoveries hung in the air like moths, beautiful and vulnerable in their light. They buoyed Mei Lin's courage and tightened the collar around her throat. "You use more than my patience," Jiao told her on the 3rd night. "You will also use our stock." Mei Lin bit her lip. She understood the arithmetic. Pockets of blue required pockets of ore. A single visible success demanded replenishment. The southern dyes were not infinite. Marina and caches would last only so many deliveries before routes were known. Before the coastal pits that fed these pigments were emptied or overrun by men who sold them at higher prices. Each jar siphoned a piece of the earth away, and with it the life of fishermen and children and fields that had fed miners. She remembered her grandmother's hands, how those hands turned the rhythm of crushing into something like prayer. She remembered being a child at the edge of the harbor and watching the sun fracture on nets painted with colors that seemed to hold summers. "We must be careful," she said aloud. "We must use them for what matters." That phrase, "what matters," was slippery. Who decided what mattered? The emperor's memory mattered to Consort Lion, who stitched private mementos and kept them in a cedar box that smelled of mothballs and rose. It mattered to scholarly Wei, who argued that to lose pigment was to lose the lexicon of meaning the court used to enshrine its rituals. It mattered to the washerwoman, who would recall the lullaby and carry that fleeting warmth across a morning's labor. But it also mattered to the Grand Secretary, who saw beauty as potential rebellion. Jiao never used the man's full name, only the dead plum phrase the workshops had come to hiss, the secretary. For him the man symbolized a logic older than color, the logic that simplified and then governed by simplification. When scholar Li Wei came to Jiao's workshop 3 days later, dusk had thinned to the color of old silk. He moved with the careful gait of a man who spent his life between stacks of paper and the attention of ministers. In his satchel were rubbings and brittle archives, records often old enough to make men speak in a softer voice. Li Wei sat on a wooden stool that had held many backs and unfolded a thin roll of paper. "They are careful with this," he said. "Officially, the record declares suppression for ritual impurity. Unofficially, it lists out names of suppliers, ports, and a list of occasions when pigments were used to sway crowds. The document says he hesitated for the faintest beat. It says those colors can inflame sentiment." Mei Lin felt anger rise like heat. It was not only an argument about pigments. It was a claim that beauty was dangerous because it could make people feel feelings that might be converted into protest, into the instability Shen feared. "So they outlawed a feeling," Mei Lin said. "They outlawed someone remembering." Li Wei nodded. "The archive points to a campaign after a southern revolt." The center concluded that regional palettes carried allegiance. Color, then, was more than ornament. It was a map of identity. They spread the roll on the bench between them. The characters, cramped and deliberate, named a mine near a southern estuary, its name half ruined by time and administration. Listed were merchants who shipped in darkness, and a minister whose favor had saved whole ateliers until he fell in disgrace and the law moved to erase the evidence of a different aesthetic order. "If the Grand Secretary frames repair as sedition," Li Wei said, "he will not argue about sentiment. He will argue about order. He will say color is disorder and disorder invites chaos. He will speak of carcasses and bread. Our job is to show this is not sedition. It is ritual healing." "Words can be as slippery as pigments," Jiao said. "You can bind them and tape labels to them, but people will always read what they fear. If Shen thinks of a color as a weapon, he will seek the smith who feeds that weapon." At night the courtyard outside Jiao's workshop hummed like a temple. The far lamps of the palace blinked. A guard's boot passed twice and then silence. Mei Lin dreamed of the bowls blue that night in a returning pattern water as a cradle then woke to the dull ache of obligation. She painted small things in the days that followed, a scholar's fan with a hidden sky, the corner of a memorial scroll to which she added a throat of crimson to restore the mouth of an embroidered bird. Each time she wrapped the object in plain cloth and sent it back into the palace, she watched for the effect, as if watching a patient recover from fever. A week into the renewed program, the court's mood changed in small increments. A steward paused in the Hall of Rites and murmured a line of poetry. A young court musician hummed a tune with a new ease. These ripples, slyly private but conspicuous in their accumulation, became a measure of Mei Lin's work. She began to keep a ledger, small and secret, where she wrote the object, the pigment used, and the effect. Her handwriting grew darker as the entries multiplied. Lines bowed like a willow under weight. But for every ledger there was a ledger of suspicion being compiled elsewhere. Grand Secretary Shen had reasons for the measures he proposed, reasons framed by famine, rebellion, and a life narrowed by grief. He had seen how color might be used to gather crowds, and how gatherers might be led by a song they could not remember knowing. He convened inspectors to review suppliers and instituted abrupt audits of workshops. No one could say for sure whether he was guided by fear alone or by an honest belief that fewer variables meant fewer calamities. To Mei Lin, the policy felt like a narrowing throat. The breath of the court grew shallow, and the space for subtle interventions shrank. Jiao's hands were tired now, more from worry than from work. "They will ask for inventories," he said. "They will want ledgers, samples, names." His voice had the texture of gravel pressed between teeth. "We will need to hide what cannot be shown and lie about what must be truth." "And if we are asked to disclose the recipe?" Mei Lin asked. The question rested between them like a pestle. Jiao did not answer immediately. He set both palms on the table and met Mei Lin's eyes. If they ask, we must tell a story that saves lives.